will continue to speak on President Lula's case. And I actually think that history there explains partially why. I mean, of course, Brazil is actually the largest country in Latin America and has a lot more power than others, but it still is subject to intense U.S. interest and interference. And you have a president who anybody with any kind of progressive or social democratic politics should be very interested in because of his enormous achievements, like eliminating hunger in Brazil, like bringing 30 to 40 million people out of poverty, like setting up a independent and rational foreign policy, like supporting indigenous rights, like supporting good environmental policies. Made mistakes, made compromises, of course, but also a workers' party that has natural and organic roots with labor forces in Brazil. And we could see the coup, the corrupt process that brought Dilma Rousseff, and very misogynistic process that brought Dilma Rousseff out of power in 2016, and the jailing without any material evidence of Lula da Silva, when he almost certainly would have been. He was Brazil's last electoral line of defense against a fascist candidate. And the Brazilian judicial system and oligarchs, under the guidance of this horrific prosecutor, Sergio Moro, jailed and silenced him in an election he was winning, and the UN said he should have been able to run in. And the point of this, again, is that this actually, to me, is emblematic of the sort of alliance of emergent fascism and capital classes from Wall Street to local oligarchs. Also, more broadly, generic anti-corruption rhetoric is the handmaiden of fascism. 3, people need a much more sophisticated understanding of corruption. There's a shockingly small amount of actual evidence of Lula's corruption, but if you demonstrated that the Workers' Party needed to get involved in various agreements, like in 2005, there was a vote buying scandal. Guess what? That's Brazilian politics. You have to bribe smaller parties to pass your electoral agenda. Those things are a problem structurally. They're fundamentally different than Jair Bolsonaro's son potentially getting direct cash transfers and employing members of a criminal organization. That's a totally different thing. This is Brian Mier. You have to read him in Brazil Wire, watch the reporting that they do at Telesur and Real News Network, obviously TMBS. Brian's really important on this. And here he is first explaining Judge Sergio Moro, who is the persecutor of Lula, now the justice minister gearing up for a war on labor unions and writing the laws that are flooding Brazil's streets with even more guns, on his role in the persecution and suppression of Lula. And then he ends with his really important declarative statement. And look, I know some people get cynical, and I understand, but there are Democrats that put themselves in a progressive position and want to be understood as progressives, and some really are progressives. And Bernie Sanders has done a little bit of this. Barbara Lee's done a little bit of this, but they need to be front and center on Brazilian democracy and freeing Lula da Silva.
What Moro's role really was during his prosecution against Lula was inquisitor. You know, the investigator can rule on his own investigation. And this isn't the normal situation in Brazil. It's not that common, but they allowed Moro to do it while he was going after Lula. It dates back to the Inquisition. And so how can Lula get a fair trial in this situation? He cannot. And that's why he's in jail, having no material evidence presented against him in either of these 2 cases.
So what's next now? Is there any chance that Lula could get out of prison someday, or what are his next steps?
Well, Greg, I'm not a fortune teller, but in my opinion, there's going to have to be some kind of regime change before he gets out of jail. They've still got one more Lava Jato investigation against him for an equally or even more ridiculous claim involving his institute, the Lula Institute, and a piece of land. You know, so even if he wins the appeal in these first 2 cases, they'll charge him on this 3rd case, and they're kind of stalling on it to make sure they can, as long as, you know, Sergio Moro is Minister of Justice and Bolsonaro's president, it's going to be very hard for Lula to get out of jail unless there's really heavy international pressure, and we just don't see that coming from the Democratic Party in the U.S.
You see that coming from center-left leaders in Europe, and apparently there was a new executive meeting of the Labor Party where Corbyn talked about Brazil and Venezuela, but also much more moderate figures like Zapatero and Hollande have called have defended Lula and this horrific imprisonment. But look, every single Democratic member of Congress needs to hear on this. It's fundamental. It's both because it's extraordinarily wrong the way this person is being treated, and also because it is central to a broader struggle about rights and determination. And also, thirdly, it's a grotesque media failure. I'm not saying that the New York Times needs to report, they can talk about the charges, they can talk about broader corruption probes, but they never contextualize corruption as a systems problem in Brazil. And they also just say he's convicted. They never explain that these court cases have never demonstrated material evidence. They're based on squeezed testimony of people looking to get out of jail by forces who are politically in bed with a profoundly authoritarian and almost certainly profoundly corrupt and overtly dangerous Bolsonaro government. But of course, this is the same New York Times editorial page that endorsed removing Chavez in 2002. Which again, set aside what you think of Chavez. That's an objective interference. Every single Democratic leader needs to speak on freeing Lula. Period.